Hey there, SHIRO listeners, SaturnDave here, reminding you that you must play Sega Saturn, and that it's contributions from listeners like you that help keep this and our other shows hosted and available on demand, in addition to our website, SegaSaturnShiro.com, where you can find all of the most up-to-date news and information from around the Sega Saturn scene. If you'd like to show your support and gain access to several perks, visit patreon.com/Shiro Media Group to become a Patreon supporter. If a monthly donation isn't possible, no worries. We still value your support in liking and sharing our content on social media and joining our Discord community to become a part of the Saturn conversation. Thank you for being a loyal listener and a part of this great community. And as always, hey everyone, welcome to Editor's Corner. This is SaturnDave, and I've got a bunch of guests today on the show. We've got TrekkiesUnite 118. We've got Derek Pascarella, ATEAM. We got Malenko, and we got Bo Bayles. How are you guys doing?
Burning Rangers go. Hey.
Good, thanks for having me.
Nice.
Doing great on this beautiful, what day of the week is it? Saturday? The holiday weekends throw you off.
Right?
Yeah, doing great this Saturday morning.
Every day has felt like a Saturday, but it is. For folks who are listening in, we're talking about hacking Saturn games, I guess tinkering with Saturn games, patching Saturn games. I don't think that there are any hard, fast limits on where the conversation will go, but I'm surrounded by higher IQs here than myself and problem solvers, so it's going to be a really interesting conversation. And I'll kick it off with Trekkies. It's possible you've been doing this the longest, I think. What projects have you been involved in?
I started actually with Lunar Silver Star Story way back in, I think, 2012, 2013, poking around, snooping at it, and it kind of just got stuck.
Right.
Then around 2017, 2018, I started digging around in Grandia and got that translation up and going. I then got involved with the Sakura Wars team, helping them with their FMVs and that. Currently working on the sequel with them as well. Also did the Mickey and Donald collection for Quackshot and Castle of Illusion.
Mm-hmm.
I did the translation patch for the floppy disk drive operator card. Currently working on Grandia Digital Museum, Devil Summoner Soul Hackers, Sakura Wars 2, and I was looking into some things with Malenko as well.
And a nifty Muxer tool.
Yes, the film Muxer tool, that was just something I made so we didn't have to deal with the old Mac environments for doing Cinepack.
Right. I mean, I realize that's not a Saturn game, but you've been injecting video into Saturn games as a result of that tool, so that's kind of cool.
Yeah, it makes it easier for people doing translation patches with it.
For sure. How about you, Malenko?
I started on this back in 2021, I think, with the Fire Pro 6-Man Scramble. And then after that, I finished the Blazing Tornado Fire Pro. I believe the one that I'm most popular for is probably Drift King 97, where everyone hates that I added Craig Stadler to it. And then I also did the NBA Jam TE hack, where I added Sonic the Hedgehog, the Mortal Kombat Ninjas, and Craig Stadler. And I'm currently working on Bomberman Fight and Terra Fantastica. And I also did a really basic bare bones patch for Street Fighter 03.
Yeah, you're pretty prolific. You've probably touched a few other things too, like at least helping other folks and stuff like that.
Yeah, getting people started. I actually get more enjoyment out of it when I help somebody else get started rather than doing my own projects. But I helped with the Silhouette Mirage project and a few others. I don't really remember them off the top of my head, but most of the work was done by other people. I just helped get them started.
That's amazing. Derek, you started out with Dreamcast stuff, right? But you've worked your way into Saturn. That's an interesting story. What projects have you been involved in, and when did you get started?
Specifically on the Saturn?
No, you can include Dreamcast. We're all Sega fans here. I'm interested in hearing about all of it.
Well, the one I'm most proud of for sure, it was the Nakaruru visual novel, Nakaruru, the gift she gave me. That was a 2-year project. A lot of work, and really proud of that one. The Sakura Wars Columns 2 game, I would say, was also pretty popular. And then Cool Cool Tune. If I had to pick 3, those 3 would be on the favorites list. and got all that stuff started basically when the COVID lockdowns kind of came along. It was, I found I had a lot more free time at home than I did before, and I just started, getting into it. And then Saturn, it was one of those things where, I mean, Dreamcast and Saturn are my two greatest console loves of all time. Like, from the day that I got those consoles as a kid till this very day, they've never been like relegated to a box in the closet or anything. Like, I've always had them, I've always played them. And when I started getting into Dreamcast hacking, I eventually knew I wanted to dip my toes in the Saturn as well, which I've started to do. Definitely a bit of a different beast, but some of the challenges make it very fun. So on the Saturn side, it's just been 2 games so far. Rabbit, which is a fighting game, that was the first one, pretty low effort kind of patch. And then the next one was Jung Rhythm, which I worked on with Malenko here and a few other people that we all know.
That's awesome. No, we're definitely going to talk about that, like, the difference between Dreamcast and Saturn. That's great. You've actually been a part of the Saturn community before you even started doing Dreamcast work, but you just kind of went that route first, obviously, because I think Dreamcast comes out a little bit on top for you, right?
It's like, I've been asked that, like, which of the two would you say is a favorite? It's like, it honestly changes like week to week, which one I feel like I'm loving a little more. But I think part of what got me interested at the Dreamcast is that so few people were doing it. Like, I already saw all of the great work being done on Saturn, and it's like, man, nobody's really given Dreamcast much attention. And part of it was a lot of immature debugging tools and such, but we've really come a long way in that regard, so it's quite different today.
Yeah, totally agree. And then last but not least, Bo, you're the newest comer to me, at least. I've gotten to know you recently, and you've been incredibly prolific with what started out, I don't know, reverse engineering Burning Rangers. Is that where it all got started?
Well, that show Uncle from Another World, where the guy like goes away in 1998 and then he comes back and he just remembers the Sega Saturn era.
Uh-huh.
So that's me. Like, when the Dreamcast went off the market, I was like, well, I guess I'm done with video games. Like, the best one is done. And so I just didn't buy any video games from like 2003 to 2022. And then,
Wow.
like we were saying, though, second year of the pandemic, it's like, oh, what's going on in the video game world since I dropped out. And it turns out nobody has dived into the Saturn games to find all the things you can find. Like, I come out of the Sonic world. Like, I got on the internet to talk about Sonic with people, and like, those games have been dissected to death. Like, probably the best reverse engineering on the planet has been dedicated to the 16-bit Sonic games. But you look at the 32-bit era, and there's still a lot in there. So that's how I got my start. And then Burning Rangers being my favorite game, that's the one I decided to learn all the reverse engineering tools on.
Everyone in this room, apart from myself, has something in common, and I would say is, like, you guys are, technically savvy. I think some of you guys are programmers, problem solvers, that kind of, where you like messing with stuff. You like getting in there and seeing how it ticks, how it works. It's not for the faint of heart, like digging into the code, using hex editors, using, tearing a game apart and just trying to see, like where it's doing stuff. A lot of people would love to do this work and are kind of enthusiastic about it, but when they find out like how much work it is, they kind of shy away. But not you guys, and that's kind of what sets you apart. And I mean, there are several other folks in the community who are doing this kind of work and who are very similar in that way. But speaking for myself, like, I might be able to edit one little memory address or something like that if I have somebody telling me what to do. But it's definitely not something that I would just stumble through and figure out on my own. So I'm curious, like, how do you get involved in this kind of thing, like from zero to like what you guys have done now, being so prolific with all these different projects?
My recommendation is, if you're any sort of programmer, you can probably fumble around with the program Ghidra, Ghidra, which is a pro-level reverse engineering tool you can get for free. And I thought, I'm going to trick myself into learning Ghidra for professional reasons by reverse engineering Saturn games, and that will hold my attention, and then I'll get really good at Ghidra, and then be able to use that in my job, and that has worked great. So you can hack your learning curve that way.
Nice. Well, before we get into a lot of the technical stuff, I am kind of interested in a non-technical question. And I've been wondering this for a while, is like what each of your guys' Saturn origin story is. You're Sega fans and you love games, and you're not just limited to Saturn, but I mean, you spend a lot of time in the SHIRO Discord, and you spend a lot of time working on Saturn related stuff. So like starting with Trekkies, I'm kind of interested in, what was your Saturn story? How did you get into Saturn? How did you discover it? And what are some of your memories?
So with me, it was basically, it would have been back in 1996, like around summer, I think. My dad just came home with it one day from Walmart or wherever he went shopping that had it. But it was when the 3 free games deal first started, and you got Virtua Fighter 2, Virtua Cop, and Daytona USA with it.
Mm-hmm.
So at the time, we were living in Illinois, and I think he had came back to Pennsylvania to visit his family for because he was on a business trip and stopped by. And my aunt had gotten the same thing, and him and my uncle were just playing Daytona USA and thought it was the neatest thing ever. So when he came back, he saw they weren't that expensive because the prices had been dropped on them, and they were doing the 3 free games deal. So he got that. And I had that throughout. I was still playing that well into like 2000.
Nice.
So we had that, and the thing I remember the most painful about it was just very hard to find games for it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like a lot of the only stores that really carried Saturn stuff that you could reliably go and get it at was Toys R Us, and we didn't really. There was only like one near us, and it was like almost an hour away. So there was it was really hard to find games. I remember around 98 when the final great dump happened and they just dropped all the Saturn stuff. You went to EB and there was at the time it was Electronics Boutique, and it was they had a pile of Saturn stuff, but it was all the sports games and stuff. So my brother got Madden 97 and NHL Power Play. I think I got Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 and one or two other games or something like that. But I remember the 2 games I really wanted when I was around 8 or so was I wanted Sonic Jam and Sonic R, and my parents told me that was had a very hard time finding those for. I think they got me one for Christmas and one for my birthday.
Yeah.
It was that was the painful thing.
Toys R Us was very old school,
Mm-hmm.
It took them a while to catch up to what was going on, so they were still very much Sega, supporting
Mm-hmm.
and stuff. And Kmart, at least where I grew up, Toys R Us and Kmart, you could actually find a fair bit of Saturn games and even Genesis games late in its life cycle. But if you went to any kind of game stores that actually focused on games, they read all the trade mags and they knew exactly what was happening. And it was you try to get Panzer Dragoon Saga, they got one copy, right? But with Toys R Us, they didn't get the memo until way late. So they were still stocking, Saturn stuff. It's crazy.
Yeah, 'cause I remember seeing nights I think it was an Electronics Boutique in a game store at the time, but it was just again, we didn't have a ton of money. So it's I could only pick one game or something if I ever got a chance to pick a game when we were out shopping.
Mm-hmm.
It's that was my thing. It's I remember seeing a lot of the stuff in some stores and we just weren't able to buy a lot of it.
Yeah. Favorite Saturn game?
Probably Burning Rangers would be my favorite one. Which that one, I didn't get that one until probably about 2008. And I got it on eBay for I think I got it for $60 complete.
Yeah.
That tells you how much the prices have gone up.
Oh yeah. I mean, $60 is a great price.
But one of my coworkers, he was into Sega stuff and Atari stuff, and he's probably about 8 years older than me. So he was in high school and had a job when this was all going on. So he has in his game room, he has this wall of just complete in-box Saturn 3D controllers. And he's they were 50 cents a piece at Electronics Boutique when they were just dumping everything. So I just bought them all.
Oh my God.
So it's he has this shelf that's just new in-box 3D controllers just sitting there because he just bought them all for 50 cents when they were dumping them.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So it's if I could go back in time with $500, I would be so happy.
Yeah, no kidding. Be horse racing or win the lottery. No, I'd go back and buy a bunch of Saturn games.
Yeah.
What about you, Malenko? What was your first interaction with the Saturn? How did you get involved with that?
Well, I'm really going to be showing my age with my story, but I bought the Sega Saturn when I was working at FuncoLand. It became a GameStop later.
Hmm.
And I traded in a bunch of like Super Nintendo games and old Genesis games and stuff. And I had a job there, so we got a little bit of a discount. So I ended up getting that. And then like every week or two, I would buy one game because, I was in high school. I didn't have a mortgage payment or a kid to feed or anything like that. So built up my collection for a while, and I ended up trading it all in for an N64.
Ooh.
Yeah. And I'm not a fan of the N64, as everyone knows. I think that's probably part of the reason why. Then I ended up building up my collection again about 10 years ago. And
Yeah.
then selling that for an emergency. And now I started building it up again about 3 years ago. And
Oh,
I'm at the
really?
halfway point.
So this recent acquisition is like not the first time you've tried.
It's my third try, actually.
Wow. But you've been smoking. You've been going along at a really fair click. Like you picking up a lot of stuff. I think you have like a huge bookcase now, right?
Yeah, it's 121 out of 242. So I'm literally at
Nice.
the halfway point of the US. And then I've got, I think, 60 or 70 of the import titles.
Would you say that it's your favorite console?
It's probably my favorite, and probably not going to get a lot of cheers for this, but the PlayStation is probably my second favorite, and Super Nintendo's third. Genesis a very, very close fourth.
I mean, yeah, like so you're a 5th gen gamer for sure. And the PlayStation's great, I mean, I don't think anybody can deny that, but what's your favorite Saturn game though?
Import wise, it's Street Fighter 03. I just love the World Tour mode. It's so much fun. And
Oh,
then
yeah.
domestic, I love Virtual Cop 2. I play it all the time. One person, two guns, John Woo style. Like I just have a blast with it.
Nice.
It's such a great port of the arcade machine too. I used to actually have the arcade, and I was like, I don't need this anymore. I've got the Saturn version.
Cool. Derek, what is your Saturn story?
I know Dave said nobody can, make the claim that the PlayStation isn't great, but ladies and gentlemen, I'm here today to tell you the Sega Saturn is so much better than the PlayStation. No, I'm just teasing. I mean, it is, but PlayStation's also great.
Yeah.
But N64, yeah, Malenko, I don't know.
I was gonna say you're about to get roasted. Yeah, no, the N64 is great too. It's got some games. It's got some games.
Yeah, sure.
But we're here to talk about Saturn, so I'm curious. As the Dreamcast guy, I'm curious. What is your experience with Saturn going all the way back?
I mean, when it was first launched and on the market, I remember being it had to be like a Walmart where they had the Saturn kiosk, and I saw Nights into Dreams, and I was begging my parents, like, please buy this for me. But I mean, I was the kid who like begged for a Genesis and then for a Sega CD, even a Virtual Boy. And like at some point they were kind of like, all right, this kid's out of control. So I didn't get the Saturn right away. But then I gotta say it had to be, so if Dreamcast came out in 99, it had to be like 97.
Oh, okay.
So there was already a lot of markdown, and stuff was cheap.
Right.
But actually, I remember it was one of those cases of like a good report card, and you get bribed and got a Saturn and a whole bunch of games real cheap. Even got it was like Nights with the 3D controller bundle.
Right.
And back then, places like you heard Malenko mention like FuncoLand, like places like FuncoLand and EB and stuff back then, they actually used to carry like Japanese Saturn games. They had a little section for them. So I remember grabbing a bunch of those, like Castlevania Symphony of the Night back then. And I even remember the employee telling me and my dad, "You sure you want to buy this? Does he have a PlayStation? Because the PlayStation version's a lot better." I never forget that. Never forget it. And I didn't learn until many years later, like what the whole big deal was between the two versions.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I fell in love with that machine. And not that many years later, I got a mod chip for it back when the old Racket Boy chips were still being sold.
Yeah.
And, was off burning discs, baby. And I make no apologies for that because it let me experience zero.
Yeah.
Because it let me experience a lot of the library. And yeah, I've been in love with it ever since.
Yeah. That's awesome. What's your favorite Saturn game, if I put you on the spot?
Yeah, I knew you'd ask. Oh, it's so hard to say. I'm so horrible with like choosing a favorite anything.
Sure. Well, what's the highlight?
If I look back at like what games have I played the most of, or that I was most in love with over the years, Magic Knight Ray Earth was a big deal to me when I got that game. I've like actually wrote this old Reddit post like 15 years ago about the story of how I bought Magic Knight Ray Earth. And And I'd say that one is probably the most special to me. But, a lot of that is tied to childhood nostalgia, all that stuff. And I also played as a kid a ton of Virtua Fighter 2 and Dead or Alive.
Nice.
So I'd say that's probably, if I just look at like raw hours dumped into these games. I mean, if you want to count Police Knots, though, because that is my favorite game of all time, and it is on the Saturn, the definitive version, of course. You could say that's my favorite Saturn game, but,
Nice. Well, you have good taste. Magic Knight Ray Earth, Police Knots. Excellent games. Yep. And last but not least, Bo, I know you're a big Burning Rangers fan, so you have that in common with Trekkies. But I'm interested, like, how did you get started with the Saturn?
I won a contest on Sega.com.
Really?
They had a Sonic Jam trivia contest, and your prize was Sonic Jam plus, I remembered as 5, but the website on archive.org says 4. They might have thrown in an extra one. So 5 Saturn games. And so I got a lot of them, but my problem was I didn't have a Saturn. And so I worked out a deal with the guy who ran the GHZ Sonic website, which was at the time the best Sonic website. And so I traded him some of the games for his brother's Saturn. He had another one. And then I was off. So I played everything I could get hold of.
Like, when was that? Like, around what time was that?
Sonic Jam came out summer 97, so it would have been then.
And you traded the games back then in like 97?
Yeah, we were on message boards.
So wait, the GHZ has been around that long?
Oh yeah, May 16th, 1997.
That's incredible. Wow. I had no idea. That is
I was
incredible.
11 and using my full name on the internet at the time, which is
of
course. Great idea. Yeah.
Yeah, well, different times, right? No, not really, but but yeah. No, that is crazy. What a trip. And so you got into Saturn in 97, and any memories that stick with you?
I like my Mount Rushmore for Saturn is Burning Rangers, Knights, Sega Rally, and Fighters Megamix. Like those 4 to me are just like perfect games and still hold up today. But as I mentioned, like I have this giant gap in gaming. I have no idea what people have been doing since then. So to me, it's like, oh, these look great. But I love those games. And since I've been doing the hacking stuff, I've looked at like hundreds of games. Like I probably hit everything except for like the Mahjong games and the dating sims.
Yeah.
And what a catalog, what a library of games. They're all so cool.
Yeah. There is some kind of rare quality about Sonic Team games, especially, Burning Rangers kind of sticks out in my mind as like one of those like hyper colorful, just in your face, kind of unapologetically bright. And I don't know, there's a visual quality, but also just like the game design and everything like that is just so Sonic Team. And
Burning Rangers is so people don't know because like, oh, it's a firefighting game or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's got this like weird Pokemon gotta catch 'em all thing where there's 108 survivors. They send you emails, which was like kind of a novelty in the 90s.
Yeah.
And the emails are like funny.
Oh yeah.
And like some of the translations don't capture like the playful stuff they were doing.
Right.
But they really poured a lot into this game, which was like for a dead system. Like they knew it was on the way out then,
but they were already
committed. On release date. Yeah, but
Burning Rangers it really is like there's nothing like it. And I'll tell you, when I saw this ad in the magazine and it was like this firefighter in a kiddie pool, I was just like, that did not appeal to me at all. Like I thought this is the weirdest looking ad, and I can't wrap my head around a firefighting game. Like how would that be cool, And then of course it's like one of the best games on the Saturn. So yeah,
the Sega ads from that era are really funny though. Like the one for Sonic Jam is a guy who has a bunch of nose rings. They're like Sonic rings,
right? Yeah,
and there's like tiny screenshots of Sonic Jam in the corner.
Yeah, kids they're not going to latch onto stuff that's that abstract, But the marketers are like, oh, we're brilliant. Just show them the game, right? But yeah, back then advertising was weird. So yeah, Burning Rangers, your favorite game of all time, I think. You've spent a good chunk of your life dedicated to Burning Rangers. You're a big Sonic fan too, though, so.
Yeah, that's my origin, is I was on the Sonic forums way back in the day, and still hang out with some of those friends. I went and saw the Sonic Symphony tour in
Mhm.
LA when it came through
Oh,
last year with some friends I had never met on the internet. Like we've been
wow.
friends on forums since the 90s, and it was so good. If you have a chance to see that, it
I've
is
heard.
fantastic.
I've heard it's like, yeah, like I didn't get to go, but that's amazing. Yeah. Everybody says like it's such a good show if you can see it.
It's not just like for the Sonic component, it's one of the best rock concerts I've ever seen too. Like fantastic show.
Well, I guess I'll start with you and work backwards this time, and I'll ask. So, is there like a dream project that you'd like to work on? Something that maybe you haven't touched yet because either because of like the difficulty or just you're not there yet. But I'm interested.
Well, I kind of realized my dream of figuring out the Burning Rangers versus mode. So this was like this legendary thing that was cut out of Burning Rangers. There's these like 2 grainy screenshots in Sega Saturn magazine UK, and we had bad scans of them in the 90s. It's like, what? This game was supposed to have a 2-player mode?
Mm-hmm.
And I found it like last year, and it's in the final game. It's like a couple of bytes to restore it.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, since then I've been happy, and then everything else is just.
So
just
now
great.
you're gonna hang it up and quit? No. Hopefully
No,
you don't. You've become kind of like everybody's knocking on your door, like, Bo, can you patch this? Even myself included.
I have I'm trying to do one a week, like either a cheat code nobody's ever known, or like patch a demo disc to show you like the prototype game that was
Mm-hmm.
it was built on, or some sort of hack where like I just did the Knights pedestrian one where you play as Elliot and Claris instead of Knights. So I'm gonna do one of those things every week, and I think I've got enough stuff till mid-January
Mm-hmm.
at that pace. So some of them are bigger, some
Yeah.
of them are smaller.
What you're
Yeah.
doing is kind of different from like, so we've got translators here, who do game translations and then folks who make tools and mess with a lot of like the audio and video compression stuff. And you're like reverse engineering and hacking these games, sometimes to bring out stuff that's been buried, features in the game that weren't ready for prime time, maybe, or they just decided they weren't going to reach the deadline. So they closed that off and just left it. But the pieces are there to kind of, make a couple edits and bring it back. I was talking with the SHIRO guys like years ago, and we were speculating, would it be possible to kind of like reverse engineer these games? And I think it was Kay who was saying like you'd have to basically like decompile the games, So how exactly are you doing that? I think you explained it briefly before, but like how are you able to decompile the code and then like recompile it?
Yeah, the thing I'm really interested in is the cutting room floor stuff, which is, they were working on it, they cut it for whatever reason, and like I mentioned the 2-player mode in Burning Rangers, but there's just a ton of cool stuff, like different costumes for characters, like we had the one in Fighting Vipers. Yeah, so the tool I use is called Ghidra, and it's kind of a mix of you can learn to read the assembly, and then they have a nice like pseudocode decompilation kind of at a function by function basis.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't get, the real source code. There's no labels. You're kind of just trying to latch onto something you understand. But yeah, I use that. I use the emulators and a little bit of custom tools that I've developed to try to get like a foothold. And then, once you understand one piece, then you can label that, and then you can see what references that, and then label that. And, the more labeling you do, the better it gets.
So is it possible then, like, I know nothing about this, so I can dream, but my dreams are not grounded in reality, but I'm just curious, like Sonic World, for example, it's this pretty robust level that's built in Sonic Jam, right? And I always have thought to myself, like, wouldn't it be amazing if through some kind of reverse engineering, rebuilding an image, if you could just kind of like smash that together with like the special stages in Sonic 3D Blast, and I don't know, like build some manner of 3D Sonic game. Is that like outside the realm of possibility? Because you don't have the source code, but like, is it impossible to do that where through redirects or something like that, you run around Sonic World, jump on the button, and then it like warps you to like a special stage or something like that?
It's like just outside of doable for like you could glue the Sonic Jam, Sonic World into the Sonic 3D Blast special stages, but
Mhm.
it would be like a hard cut from one to the other, which is how they do it in Sonic 3D Blast in the first place.
Right.
But I don't know, like the tools are pretty good these days. I don't want to say anything's impossible, but it's probably impossible for me.
Hmm.
What I really like is like the 12-byte change that really alters the game in a fundamental way. So I did a 2-byte change that makes Sonic 3D Blast just all special stages, which
Right.
to me is an improvement. Or like the Burning Rangers thing is like a dozen bytes restore the 2-player mode, which is pretty cool. So
Right.
yeah, I like the stuff that's like just there below the surface,
Hmm.
and I'm less on like creating something new out of it. And part of that is just like I'm not much of a game designer, and
Right.
part of it is it's very difficult without the real source code.
Mhm.
But yeah,
So you can't get source code from a compiled image. In other words, you can't like decompile it and get, like, for example, the Sonic World graphics and the core gameplay there is so solid. If somebody wanted to like flesh out and build more of a game out of that, you think it'd be easier for them to just go from the ground up and do it themselves than try to take and use that code in any meaningful way?
yeah, I think so. And there's a project or two where they're recreating it in Unity or maybe Unreal Engine,
Hmm.
and using the assets, and you can get pretty close that way. One thing you could do, which is very doable, is within the Sonic world that's there, like change which objects are present and where they're placed.
Right.
And it would be pretty straightforward to do that in the Sonic 3D Blast special stages. You could say like, oh, I want to make my own course, and the rings go here and the springs go here and stuff like that.
It's like a level editor kind of type thing.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I mean, I used to be very skeptical, and then you guys all showed me what was possible, and I'm like thinking, okay, in the next 5 years, what other kind of secrets are folks going to touch on? I don't rule anything out at this point, but yeah, sometimes it seems like it really is easier, maybe just to build from the ground up, kind of like those guys in Nick's video. He talks about the dudes who had to basically remake Virtua Racing from the ground up, just looking at the arcade cab. It's kind of like that. You kind of have to just use it as an example and build your own. But, trying to get the same physics and trying to do all the same stuff might be somewhat difficult.
So that's where like the reverse engineering stuff can really help. Like, let's say you recreate the thing in Unity, but you really want to nail like, okay, when you jump, you go this high, and when you run, you go this far. Like, you can use the reverse engineering tools to really nail that. And you guys may know about the Burning Rangers HD tribute thing that Andreas is doing.
Oh, yeah.
A couple of years ago he did. So he is very dedicated to really nailing different aspects of that game, and I've contributed in some small part to that. Like, so he has it so that the survivors in Burning Rangers will appear in the right place and in the right order.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was like reverse engineering what algorithm the game uses to decide who goes where. But we nailed it. Like we've got it exactly the way the original goes.
So that's not randomly generated?
Well, it's not on the first time you play through, and then after that it's random. But then it's like, okay, well, how does the random number generator work?
Right. Okay. So with that remake that he's doing, he also doesn't have the source code, and he's doing his best to try to capture all the physics and the feel of the game, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure Sega has the source code.
Right.
Sometime in the last like year and a half, a story came out about the developers who did the Knights remaster for PS2.
Mm-hmm.
They were supposed to do that in like 9 months or something, and it took them 2 years. And then they just looked at Burning Rangers and they said, no way.
Right. Well, I'll move on to Derek here and talk about what was it like working on Dreamcast games, doing translations for that, and then jumping into the Saturn. And what were the obstacles that you faced on either system, and how is it different?
Good question. Well, I mean, on the one hand, you have a lot of similarity, right? Saturn uses the Super H2 Hitachi CPUs. Dreamcast uses the Super H4. So the assembly language itself is actually very, very, very similar. Otherwise, it would have been a lot more difficult to kind of take that leap. And as Bo was explaining, with the use of modern disassemblers like Ghidra, you have such an easier time making sense of. Just backtrack for a second for those listening, because Dave, you had asked like, okay, so how are you looking at the game's code, how are you making changes? If you figure, you take like a game executable from a Saturn game or any game, throw it into a hex editor, you're just going to see a whole bunch of bytes that comprise that executable. And there's going to be assembly instructions in there, actual machine instructions. There's going to be usually like embedded text or graphic data. So when you use a tool like Ghidra and you tell it this executable is for this particular CPU, it gets loaded into RAM memory at this address. Therefore, all like relative pointers should be adhering to that. What Ghidra will do is actually take all of those seemingly nonsensical collection of bytes and show you the actual assembly instructions or the opcodes that comprise all of the game's logic. So in the case of SH2 and SH4, it's 2 bytes per instruction. And so in that way, you're not really even, like Bo was saying, you're not decompiling and recompiling anything. Those changes you're making in Ghidra or that you're writing in some other tool and compiling and pasting in, whatever the case may be, it's literally the same thing as if you were to make changes in a hex editor. The only difference is you have to be some type of, like a Rain Man type savant to look at assembly instructions in a hex editor and be like, yeah, I understand what this is doing. But yeah, there's a lot of crossover. I'd say the endianness difference is a big one. And for those unaware, that's kind of the order. You take, for example, like if you had a number being represented, a hexadecimal number, like, OA03, right? On the Saturn, you would just see it in big endian as OA03. And then on the Dreamcast, that would be represented with those 2 bytes swapped. So 03 OA. And that's also true of like Intel-based CPUs and some other ones. So it's kind of like a mindset to you got to like flip your brain when you're looking at things stored like floats or pointers and such. Like, okay, I'm not reading right to left now. I'm reading left to right. Things like that. I'd say some of the other really big differences are, and I was actually surprised to learn this, Saturn games, and I guess PlayStation games also, they use multiple binaries or executables usually. Like rarely, if ever, do you just have like one. Well, you definitely do have it. It just seems rare in my experience. Rarely on Saturn do you just have one executable that is the whole game. Whereas on Dreamcast, I've literally never seen a game that leverages more than one executable unless we're talking about like launching like an email client that's embedded in some Japanese games or the web browser. So that makes it an extra challenge. Like, okay, I've got 3 executables. Where does this one get loaded into RAM? Where is it referencing code from the other executable?
Interesting.
But
it seems a little disjointed. Like with Dreamcast, they were able to streamline things a bit more, perhaps due to the hardware or just their level of experience. But yeah, with the Saturn, everything is like pointers, one program pointing to another.
Yeah, but I'm not really sure why the case may be. It could just be like development practices and trends changing over the years. It could be like with the Katana dev kits, when they gave people examples of how to code this stuff, they just said like, here, just do it this way. And I really couldn't say why. Because there's nothing that would really prohibit anybody from doing it differently on either machine, as far as I know. But the one thing that does make, kind of making sense of all of the disjointed, as you said, game executables a little easier to do on Saturn is there's definitely superior debugging tools on Saturn. And that was actually true almost up until like just a few months ago. I think Dreamcast has come a long way with some actual debuggers that you can use in an emulator. There was a time when I started this that there was none. It was literally a case of like using tools like Cheat Engine to look at RAM memory and then using Ghidra to look at the assembly code. Like no way to actually set breakpoints, find out where a game is doing what, step through the instructions. But I still made ends meet somehow with that workflow. And I'd say some of the other limitations, or not limitations, I'd say differences in Saturn is like graphic formats. And just like a sense of uniformity. We all know old games, everybody did everything different, right? Every developer, even if they did like 5 games for the machine, they'll do different graphics formats, different compression algorithms, all this stuff. Dreamcast definitely is a bit more uniform in that like almost every game uses Power VR graphics. Almost every developer leveraged a lot of the SDK library functions. So like once you learn to identify them, you can find them in a disassembler like Ghidra. Meanwhile, on Saturn, everything is like completely bespoke. At least not everything, but a lot of things from what I've seen. Obviously, you have stuff like Cinepack Video that guys like Trekkies and such have done a lot of great work with. But even for stuff like Jung Rhythm, right? Malenko did all the graphics for that. God bless him. But there was a couple, not a couple. I don't know, how many were there, Malenko? Like maybe like 5 or 10 that were using that weird 15 byte per pixel format that I had to write the conversion tools for. I don't remember now.
Yeah, with all the big portraits for the players.
Right. Oh, and the title screen graphic too, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So like, Crystal Tile wasn't doing the job there, so I had to write, custom tools for that. But yeah, it's very interesting, the two machines. You definitely get like RAM and VRAM limitations on Saturn that you don't see on Dreamcast.
Mm-hmm.
But it's Sega and it's SH, and I love it. So
was the choice to start with Dreamcast just purely because of your love for that console, or that it was easier to kind of get your foot in the door with that stuff?
Definitely not easier. Had I said I want to get into PlayStation reverse engineering or SNES or even like Mega Drive, Genesis, it probably would have been a lot easier.
I gotcha.
Not to disparage any of the work like the PlayStation hackers do, because some of those people are brilliant, but like there's a lot that makes that very easy to get started with compared to what we're talking about here. It was more like I was too dumb to know the difference, Dave. I was just like, yeah, I'm going to do this.
Okay. I gotcha.
And just cracking away at it.
Nice. Well, you talked about working with Malenko, and I'm interested to move on to Malenko and ask. So one thing I have noticed, Malenko, is you do work a lot with graphics and Crystal Tile. Can you explain to folks kind of what Crystal Tile is and how you use it, and in what kind of cases it comes in handy?
Well, I don't think I use it the way that you're supposed to. A lot of people use it as the actual graphical editor. I just use it to open up the raw files, and then I copy everything out to Photoshop, do all my work, flatten the image, and then paste it back into Crystal Tile.
Really?
Yeah, I don't think that's what the objective was. It's supposed to be the editor itself.
Oh, well, Trekkie says that's what he does as well.
Oh, okay. Well, then I don't feel so bad about it.
That's kind of what I would do, too. I wouldn't necessarily know how to edit an image in that. I did download Crystal Tile and tried to make some sense of it. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm just going to work in Photoshop because that's what I know.
I have a bit of a leg up from most of the other people that use it because I can read a lot of Chinese because of my wife. So I use the untranslated version of it. So I know what all the actual shortcuts are on the keyboard.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're in there and you're trying to figure out like how wide the tiles are, you can just hold down the Alt key and use the left and right arrows, and it changes the width of the tile. Same thing with up and down for the height. Mm-hmm. So instead of like manually changing the number one at a time, you can just do that. And then changing the offset, you just hold control, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. What was the first project that got you into all this hacking or editing?
I really loved the Fire Pro games.
Right.
I used to play X Premium all the time on my Super Nintendo. Well, it was a bootleg EverDrive, but now I have a real one.
Right.
And actually, I have the import games as well, but there was a guy named, I think, Sidra that used to do the patches, and I played the crap out of those games. And I saw that they had a 6-player version on Saturn. I was like, I've got to figure out how to do this. So I hopped in the Discord. I bugged the crap out of Trekkies and Anthony's, and they kind of walked me through how to just basically get started and find the data. And it's all downhill from there, or uphill from there, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, that's the whole teaching a man to fish thing. I've seen that happen several times. Somebody will come into the community and they'll know nothing. And then a couple folks, who are willing to take the time, kind of show them the tools, and show them kind of how to get started. And then 3-4 years later, they've got like a bunch of translations under their belt. It's crazy.
Dave, can I take one moment? I just have to give Malenko a lot of praise because, first of all, like he said, yeah, I had to bug Trekkies and Knight about like, how do I do this? How do I do that? But this guy has put together tutorials on Sega Extreme for locating graphic data, making changes to it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, stuff that it takes time to sit there and write documentation. All of us on this call
mm-hmm.
or in this room, this virtual room, who are software engineers, we all mostly hate writing documentation every now and then we enjoy it, but mostly we hate it. But like Malenko's gone to great lengths to document this stuff, and he's always, I mean, there's so many little projects that got started because somebody found one of his tutorials on just the basics of getting the graphics done.
Right.
You know, and it's like he really deserves a lot of credit. And plus he grinds like crazy. Like if you look at what he had to do to get those Fire Pro games done, I mean, like Knight was always breaking his balls like, you know, you could do a lot of this easier if you just wrote some tools. And he's like, I'm good. I got it. I'm doing it this way. And it's amazing.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Malenko, we love you.
Which is a good segue to my next question from Malenko was like, sometimes you get folks with like pie in the sky ideas about, you know, I want to do this, or I want to, you know, here's a project that's really ambitious and I want to undertake this, but they know zero about it. Right. And they come in kind of half expecting folks to do some of the work for them. You know, and those projects usually die out pretty quick. Like I'm not even one of you guys in terms of like translation and stuff like that, but I can always kind of tell when a project might be a little too ambitious and the individual doesn't seem like they're really willing to get their hands dirty and do the work required. And I mean, this is kind of intimidating to some people, you know, who are maybe not incredibly technical. But my question to Malenko, since you do tutorials and stuff, is, in a nutshell, like how does somebody get involved in this stuff? How can they get started if they're really intimidated by a lot of this technical stuff? Like where do they start if there's a game that's like their favorite game and they really want to translate it?
That was kind of why I did the tutorials. I would see people constantly come in and ask the same questions that I was asking when I was first starting. So I figured, let me get something up there that someone can look at their own pace with lots of pictures and everything, just to get them just a foothold into getting started. I'm kind of the outlier here because I'm not a software developer like the rest of them. I'm a network engineer and I have to do documentation all the time. So
right,
it was just like a little piece of work for me. But really, just not being afraid to screw up or break stuff and see what happens. Just, I mean, there's no harm in typing some random bits and then seeing what happens. And if it doesn't work, change them back and try something else. I mean,
right. Yeah.
Eric can testify how many times I've screwed up trying to get Bomberman Fight to run the way that we want, and I keep finding new and creative ways to break what he fixes. So
yours is a trial and error approach, kind of, you know, just poke around.
Can't talk about it.
It's brute force.
We're not going to talk about Bomberman Fight on this recording, Malenko. Can't be done.
Oh, he can edit it all out. That's fine.
It's been a great source of torture.
Oh, goodness.
Mutually.
It'll be well worth it. At least, you know, you'll have my thanks and gratitude, you know, once it's released.
I just want to put this out there. You have not experienced pain until you've had to look through either Sakura Wars games code. Those games are jank.
Yes. And it's interesting how they just kind of randomly decide to bake in text, you know, sometimes to an image, you know, instead of like, okay, why couldn't this just have been a text overlay?
Dave experienced that when we asked him if he could edit an image for us.
Yeah, I'm just like, okay, I'll do it, but like, why couldn't they have done this in overlay text? I have no idea.
I don't get it either.
It's random. That's the thing with where I was saying with Derek is like Dreamcast. It seems like they maybe knew what they were doing to a degree at that point, and they had some kind of standardization. Whereas with Saturn, it's just kind of like, oh, they decided to do an interesting character width here, or they decided to do some strange compression here. Why? Who knows? Like, what benefit did they see in it? I don't know. I'd have to go back to 1996 and ask the dude. But yeah, it's like with Saturn, it's so many different games and it depends on like first party, third party. Like it's so random, like the decisions that they made. But that can make it difficult for somebody coming in and they're like, okay, this is my favorite game. I want to get started with it. It's some kind of obscure third party game, right? And there is none of that standardization. So you guys try to help. And it turns out, oh, this is a really steep learning curve or like a really steep obstacle to do this game. Can you talk about that, Malenko? Like how some Saturn games are almost like a walk in the park, and that's allowed you to be incredibly prolific because some are like easier than others, and then others are like, wow, this is going to take me like a year. What do you find is kind of like the difference maker when it comes to an easy translation and an incredibly difficult one?
So actually, my first two projects covered both of those bases pretty well. So with Fire Pro, 6-Man Scramble, it was all in Shift JIS. So I had to and I did it apparently the hardest way possible. Was I was making 2 letters in English per Japanese tile,
Mm-hmm.
and I had this giant matrix of like if I needed EH, it would be like 0572, and if I needed AT, it would be 8413, and I just had to manually hex edit them all in. And I did that for quite literally hundreds, maybe even thousands of hours.
Oh
And
my
then
God.
when I took a look at Blazing Tornado, all the text supported this ASCII value. So I was just literally just typing it in English in the hex editor, and it was showing up in the game. So it took, I think, 2 months to do Blazing Tornado and over 2 years to do Six-Man Scramble.
So can you, to a complete layman, can you explain to me what Shift.js is and why would they use that versus like ASCII?
There's so many glyphs in Japanese
Uh-huh.
that you can't just use shift values. You run out of values in 2 bytes or 1 byte.
I gotcha.
Yeah, they're just character encodings, Dave. So you
Yeah.
have like ASCII, which is like the traditional
Right.
1 byte used to represent the majority of, like Latin and Latin language characters. And then Shift.js would use 2 bytes, like Malenko said, so you can fit the huge
Kanji.
breadth of kanji and all of that. So
I gotcha.
those are the 2 character encodings you're most likely to find if you're going to find anything standardized. But a lot of these old games just use random one-off character encodings. Like we're starting, the first character in our font sheet will be 0001, and then, or who knows, right? It's all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and like with Sakura Wars, every basically like sub chapter of those games use their own unique encoding.
Mm.
So they only put in the characters that are going to be used in that chapter, and that's the encoding that's going to be used for that chapter for all the text in it. So there's like thousands of different encoding schemes in Sakura Wars. And that is what made that game take such a long time to get like anything rolling in those, is because just figuring out how that worked.
Why do you think there are so many? Like what?
In Sakura Wars, I think it was just they thought that would save memory. So they were only then pulling in the characters they needed.
Yeah.
A lot of them, I think that's generally what it is. It's just trying to figure out how can we use the least amount of memory for our font.
So what does that send the message that like they were never planning on translating it? Like they didn't make it.
Either that, or it's like it's one of those things where if you had the source code, it would be trivial to undo. It's just when you don't have the source code, it can be really like confusing to try and dump the script out. Because a lot of games they'll use the same font sheet throughout. So once you find that font sheet and get it like decoded, you can just dump the text. Mm-hmm. Whereas with Sakura Wars, it was like every chapter you're finding my font sheet doesn't line up now. I need to get a new font sheet. And trying to identify like low resolution kanji can be very difficult, especially if like Japanese is not your native language.
Yeah, the devs probably had a tool that said,
right,
hit package and it'll drop it into the binary. Whereas we're working with that artifact and trying to like reconstruct something out of it.
Probably one of the most like clever ones I saw was in Grandia, and what the devs did there is they used both single byte encoding and double byte and 2 byte encoding with the font. And how they did it is they made a paging system. So every page is 256 entries. So the first page is all your ASCII characters, your katakana characters, your hiragana characters, and any kind of special unique characters for like hearts, stars, numbers, all that kind of stuff. And that's in the first like 256 entries, and those are all single byte. And then the next, there's like I think 5 or 6 more pages after that of your kanji characters. And how they would do that is basically if the first byte it read started with like a 1, and then it would be like 1 0 or 1 1 1 2 1 3 1 4 1 5. That told it what page it needed to go to, and then the next entry was where it needed to go to get the character. Mm-hmm. So their kanji was all in those later pages. So it kind of worked in a way where they could keep their script pretty concise, because a lot of times they're using those hiragana and katakana characters, and they're only using single byte. And then only when they need the kanji in that do they need to go to double byte. That was an interesting one, which I actually I sorted out and figured out for Digital Museum so we could start editing the script in that. But for the original one, I didn't have to mess with it because I already had the translation.
It's my understanding that font width sometimes poses an obstacle, I guess, in terms of trying to translate, a line of Japanese text into English, right? Because the character width is different, or there's like more words. 5 kanji might equal more in terms of like English text. Can you speak to that a little bit and explain also what is variable width font? Like, how does that all work?
So Japanese is what's called like a fixed width font usually.
Mhm.
So a lot of these games are using a font that's 16 by 16. So each character is like a square of 16 by 16. Whereas like in English and that, most of our fonts are like, if it is a fixed width font, it's going to be like half that width. It's going to be like 8 by 16 because when you have big fat characters like that, it just looks weird when you write it like that.
Right.
So like for Grandia, it already supported that. So you could hit like there's just a byte you could put at the start of the text sequence and it would change it to that shorter width character. So that's what we did for that one. But for some, like for Soul Hackers, even that's not enough. And you see like we run off the side of the text box. So a variable width font system is something where you need to do a little bit more coding to it. And it's basically, it adjusts where the next character is going to be drawn based on the width of the previous character. So like, for example, like the character M, that's going to take up probably the full like 8 pixels of width that you have. Whereas I is going to take up maybe like 2. So it basically adjusts where it's going to start drawing that next character to kind of scrunch the words together more in like a more natural way of like how we see it. Like if you just look at your text in like Discord, that's variable width. So you see like it's not preserving the same amount of width for every character. They kind of like scrunch, like L's will scrunch together, things like that.
Sure.
So for Soul Hackers, that's what Mr. Conan and I have been working on to try and address that issue, because when you scrunch it all together, the text will suddenly fit in the box. It takes a little bit of time to tweak it and everything. And some games, like for example, Soul Hackers, it has the same code copied into about 15 different executables that need to be edited, and they all
oh my god,
there's like right, and there's about like 10 different places where it's being jumped to that text routine, so it's trying to find all of them and correct them all that is like the big headache there. Whereas what Mr. Conan came up with is him and I both been working with Ghidra to try and figure out where all the text routines are. But then he actually developed a framework that he put together where we can just write C code, compile it, and then it will give us the assembly. We can easily paste it in to replace the existing text routines. So that makes it a lot easier to do those kind of edits.
Yeah, and some of these tools are more internal, and they'd be so specific to a single project that you wouldn't end up sharing them with the community. But it's very interesting how you guys tend to write tools in order to help make your jobs easier, unless you're Malenko, I guess, and you just brute force.
Well, so Malenko keeps using this one tool I wrote for Soccer Wars for the mini games. I keep looking like, stop doing that. That's really jank. Stop it.
He's like, hey, but it's working for it.
So it's one I made for the mini games where it's like it basically, because when I came on, they were trying to get it done. They were in the point where they're trying to finish it up, and they originally weren't going to translate the mini games. They originally weren't going to put subtitles on. So I'm trying to quickly get this done. I'm like, I don't have to, because each mini game in Soccer Wars had its own text routine. And I'm like, I don't have time to reverse engineer all of these. So I said like, well, how many characters do I have available in the font sheet? Oh, I have space for about like 600. Okay, how many actually unique character combinations I have? Oh, I only have like 300. Okay, we're going to write a tool that's going to scan the script I write and get all the unique 2 character pairs, and we're going to make a font sheet of that. And that's the tool that he's been using for a while.
Nice. Hey, well, if it works,
like it works. It's just it can be very janky at times. So like especially like when you're trying to get your spacing right and that. So that's why like when I've seen him like trying to work that, like I'm like going like stop, just fix the font system. It's easier, trust me.
Malenko, you want to comment on that?
Well, luckily I haven't had to do any more of the 2-character glyph hacks, so I haven't had to use that tool as much. But until he writes something better, I'll keep using it.
Hey, yo. So that's on you, Trekkies. No, but I'm curious, Malenko, like you're working on Bomberman Fight, which, as you said, is kind of a headache, right? And then Terra Fantastica is somewhere in the background, right? Like that's like a long game kind of thing, like is that something you're still working on, or was that just something you were poking around with?
It's being worked on. The only thing left to get done by Mr. Conan is for him to put the graphics compressor in, but everything else is ready to go, and we actually have the first few levels completely done.
But with that game, there's just so much text that needs to be translated, right?
Yeah, we already have it all dumped, and now I just have to edit, like basically highlight the Japanese, delete it, type in the English, and then run the compiler, and that's it.
Okay, cool. And I mean, you speak Chinese, so aren't there a lot of like Chinese kanji in there?
There's enough that I can figure out the gist of what's going on, but I have a native translator helping with it.
Oh, nice.
Solon Nerfurter.
Oh, okay, cool.
I'd say he's also helping me with Bomberman Fight.
Excellent. Nice. Yeah, I mean, shouts to the folks who actually do the raw translation, you know, and are able to kind of look over things and give you a natural sounding translation over like DeepL or Google Translate, you know. I think without those folks, you know, these translation projects would not be as good. It's probably not something that is too much of a big deal for something like a Drift King game. That's pretty straightforward. You know, you can get by with like a transliteration. It's just a car game, right? You know, but yeah, for some of these like sprawling stories with, you know, a bunch of nuanced dialogue.
Funnily enough, I used 2 real translators for the Drift King project.
You did? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Huh.
None of that was machine learning. I only use that stuff for like the menus, so I know where I'm going until the translation's ready.
I was really impressed with the fact that you also were able to translate the captions over the video too.
Yeah, so I had a native speaker listen and transcribe everything, and then Shadow Mask went in and out of the subs.
Okay, so Shadow Mask, did he basically just do like a hard-coded sub kind of thing for that video?
Yep, and we went through a bunch of iterations of it until I got one that I liked that looked like an old like 90s VHS closed captioning, and I was like, that is perfect, and then he baked them into all the videos.
Didn't you do something similar, Trekkies, with Grandia? Am I misremembering, or were there not captions over some of the video?
So we had to actually reverse engineer the actual video encoding they did for Grandia. And then I added the subtitles that were included in the HD remaster.
I see.
They are basically hard baked into the video, and I re-encoded them. So that was a bit of a pain because it uses a completely custom it's kind of an MPEG-like codec they did.
Right.
But it's not.
Like some people thought it was like QuickTime or Apple or something like that, but that was really just a wrapper or something, right?
Yeah, they're technically like .move files, and they have the QuickTime header, but nothing is actually like it.
It's proprietary.
Like what's in that header is a lie. You can't trust it.
That's
so
great.
It has like 1 or 2 places where it skips to where the actual data is, and then it's like completely custom.
Huh.
So it's kind of like this hacky MJPEG kind of thing they did. It sort of follows the standard, but then it sort of doesn't, and does its own kind of compression stuff on top of it.
Yes.
So I think it was Nanashi is the one who helped on Sega Extreme reverse engineer that, and he wrote
right.
He wrote an encoder in Python to re-encode it. And it was basically it basically extract all the frames and then re-encode each frame and put it back together. And I had written a tool to basically remux it back together into the file formats.
Yeah. It also used like a really nascent version of like ADX, right? Like they were developing that for the Dreamcast, like, you know, in that transition period, and Grandia being a really late game had.
So ADX was actually originally developed for the Saturn. So one of the first games I think that used it was Vadalva. It used it.
Grandia,
yeah.
Burning
Soccer
Rangers?
Wars 2. Yeah, Burning Rangers uses ADX. Soccer Wars 2 uses it. Lunar 2 Eternal Blue uses it. There's quite a few.
Mm-hmm.
Which, like, the reason why a lot of those late Saturn games suddenly got that boost in Cinepack quality is because they started using ADX audio in the Cinepack.
Mm.
So then that basically preserved a lot of the bit rate and got it so they could get a better quality encode. Yep.
Nice.
So, so it was basically the ADX wasn't really the hard part to figure out. It was more trying to figure out what the heck they were doing with the video to get that sorted out so we could write our own encoder to encode the frames back in with the subtitles.
Mm. And with this new project that you're working on, Soul Hackers, you've definitely said it's one of the most challenging projects you've worked on, simply because 2 translations like mashed into the 3DS version.
So Soul Hackers is just, from what I've been told from other people that have worked with Atlas stuff and Megami Tensei stuff, it's typical Atlas jank.
Mm.
where it's just there's lots of weird things they did. With the 3DS one, it's kind of like the 3DS port is kind of like a mishmash of the Saturn version and the PS1 version. There's some files I found where it's like they're literally just the PS1 files, and there's others I found where they're literally just the Saturn files, and they shoved the English into them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like I can get them to work, and for the most part, there's just certain things here and there where I need to find where they would basically, instead of actually translating the original files, they added their own files, and they did some like jank on the 3DS behind the scenes to inject it in. So those ones I've had to find where the original files were on Saturn and put that translation where it belongs. So Saturn can actually use it, because their kind of wrapper layer that they're doing above it can't work on Saturn. The other thing that's just been weird with that one is they just do a lot of things that just don't make any logical sense. Like with the name entry screen was one that just confused me for the longest time of why they ever did this. And it was like, so when you enter your name in Soul Hackers, you enter your like actual like first and last name, and then you enter your screen name. And there's a buffer area in memory where it writes the values to. So where it writes it writes them based just like it has like X amount of bytes reserved for the first and last name and X amount for the screen name, and it just writes them in there. And you're thinking, okay, that's it. That's easy. I can just change the values they're going to get in there. That works for the screen name. It doesn't work for your actual first and last name. And the reason for that is even though it gets written to that buffer and it's in that value, and the game, if you put like an ASCII value in there, will read it, that's not actually how it gets drawn on screen. What they did is they did this really weird jank where in the Japanese version, when they write the name to the first and last name to the buffer, they're writing a hard-coded value every time to it. And instead what they do is they self-modify the font sheet by copying the characters to a very specific spot in the font sheet for the first and last name. So then those values it hard codes into the buffer for the name correspond to that section of the font sheet. So it's like they only do that for the first and last name. For the screen name, they do it normally like you'd expect. It just reads the values it puts in the buffer at that memory location. I have no idea why they did that with the first and last name. It doesn't make any sense, because you can just put an ASCII value or just put the actual like normal character values in there and it'll read it just fine. I don't know why they did that. It doesn't make any sense. But trying to reverse engineer that and figure out what it was doing was just a massive headache.
I was going to ask you, so what's the ETA on Soul Hackers?
So basically, I have CJ Uekura and one or two other people test playing it for me, and there's a couple bugs they've been finding that I've been working on. Once I'm sure all the bugs have been sorted out and it's stable, and that all the text has been translated and is where it needs to be, that's when I'm going to start then focusing on trying to get the variable width font system in. So I don't like to put release dates or ETAs on it, but
Sure.
I say hopefully it's getting there.
You'll probably be there by the contest, by the end of the year, you think?
I would hope, but again, I'm not going to put any like dates or anything on it.
Sure.
Because you never know what you're going to run into.
No.
And the other one is like with some of the other projects like Soccer Wars 2, we've been kind of gaining some momentum there. So I've been helping and focusing over on that one a bit more lately.
Mm-hmm.
So it really just depends on when I have time to go through and start sorting out bugs and that. But yeah, like I would like to say hopefully by the contest I'll have at least a build that's stable and has all the text in where it needs to be. But whether I'll have the variable with font and everything working by then, I don't know.
I gotcha. Derek, I'm curious. So what's the biggest obstacle that you've faced in either Dreamcast or Saturn? The toughest thing you've had to overcome in order to get out a translation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, definitely the font or the text rendering routines are one of the most difficult things to overcome in some cases. In some cases, it's extremely simple. Like the first of the two Love Hina games on Dreamcast I'm working on, although it's kind of, I don't want to say it's stalled. It's just, it's a long haul trying to get translators who are really interested in working on that particular project. That was a case where I found the floats near the text rendering function that stored the number for tile spacing, and doing a half-width font tile hack was like extremely trivial and took just like a couple minutes of it. Oh, there it is. Meanwhile, Nakoruru, which is, the only English language visual novel on the Dreamcast, and I'm very proud of that because I love visual novels, even if they're not overly popular amongst the gaming public. That doing the font width hack on that game took, oh my gosh, I don't even know. I don't, and the funny thing is, the amount of time I spent on it, I really wonder if I would ever devote that much time again to something like that. But I'm glad I did. It was a case, I don't want to say similar to what Trekkies was describing with Soul Hackers, where you had the text rendering routine in multiple binaries. There was only one binary, but the text rendering routine was kind of copied in like at least a dozen places.
Right.
And of course, when you look at it, look at the assembly itself, it's not like it's a one-to-one, like, oh yeah, here it is, and here it is again. Like, it's always slightly different, so it was very difficult to try to locate all of them. But I did, and then, of course, with that game, there was crazy stuff like, okay, so once you've got the font tile spacing, now you have to worry about maximum characters per line, because the game would auto-line break. Okay, fix that, great, now what? Oh, maximum characters per dialogue box. Okay, modify that. Then come to find out there's a text buffer of a preset size because the game only ever expected 76 Shift-JIS characters in a text buffer. And now you've got to like double it and all of this stuff. And then, oh, what else did I break in RAM because I doubled it? What did I, what data did I overwrite? So that was like a lot of work. Yeah, I mean, to this day, I kind of still think of it as the most challenging. Although, I've had some other things that were kind of, I don't want to say like technically challenging, more just like, okay, let me wrap my head around this. Like even for Jung Rhythm, for example, like to rewrite all of the new English text data, I had to find every file that was in RAM at all times and find empty space in it so that I could write all of the text data to all of these unused spots and then update all of the pointers to those strings automatically. Like, it's something we've all done.
Okay.
Particularly for that game, it was like,
required
oh my
a lot.
gosh, like, okay, hold on, yeah, it's not like from a technical perspective, it's not like, oh, this is so hard, but you have to like really sit there and say, okay, I need to map all of this out. I can't let anything break my attention and my focus, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that by comparison, doing like the VMU stuff for the Dreamcast and also you've also kind of revived like these HTML website kind of things, within the Dreamcast games? Your translations have been very thorough, I should add. But would you say by comparison, those parts were actually pretty trivial, or were those also challenging?
No, I mean, Dreamcast games that had the baked-in web browser, all I really did was, I say all I really did, but, it took a bit of work. I took the Japanese language Dream Passport browser and basically imported in all of the English assets, and then also did some stuff like removed the screensaver timer and some other things, like when you launch the browser, it'll give you like a VMU save load screen for loading browser settings, which is completely useless and just kind of ruins the user experience a bit when all you care about is showing people some bonus content. Mm-hmm. So like once I got that working, I also added VMU icon support to the Dream Passport browser. That's right. Yeah, so that way when you do load up the bonus content from the title screen, you'll still see like, the game icon or a special icon that says, bonus content with like a picture of one of the characters. Like once I kind of got all that figured out, which probably just took a few weeks, it's mostly just a copy paste job for every game since then. It looks like it's really a lot of work or like totally custom, and it kind of is, but it's a lot easier than some of this deep assembly hacking stuff.
Yeah, and you did translate for the VMU as well. Is that like a...
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, you're right. I guess I should think of that as really challenging. I can't even remember what CPU the VMU uses. They just call it like the potato, but there's an actual name.
Right.
I want to say it's from Motorola. I could be wrong. But all those VMU games or applications, all of those are written in assembly.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody wrote those in C and compiled them, even back then or today. So actually to modify some of those, I actually had to find a disassembler that just spit out a text file for those VMU applications, and then go to town from there.
Nice.
That was a lot of fun. And I'm not even being facetious. I was actually like, I can't believe I'm assembly hacking VMU games. What's going on? This is awesome.
Right. And on Cool Cool Tune, you've got this crossover with the Neo Geo Pocket Color, right? Did you have to work with that at all? Like getting the link cable and trying to, or was there a translation for the Neo Geo Pocket Color version too?
So there's a very, like a version, 0.01 type translation for the Neo Geo Pocket Color game. It's like very bare bones.
Okay.
But I actually bought a link cable just to work on that game, and I always wanted a Neo Geo Pocket Color, so I got one also.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say just for that game, but it was kind of like, it was what tipped the scale. So the only thing I really had to do special there was I had to get every single possible scenario that you could kind of see with a link cable, and make sure that all the translated text and graphics like lined up and made sense. So it was kind of like a lot of grunt work, but if anybody actually wants to do every single link cable feature they can between the Dreamcast and the Neo Geo Pocket Color game, they can. It'll all be copacetic.
That's amazing. What a labor of love. I do really appreciate that about the work that you do. It's always very thorough. If you don't leave any stone unturned, if you're able to, I think you might have come up against one or two little tiny bits where it just couldn't happen, but I think for the most part, you've been able to do like 99.9% completions on these translations.
Yeah. It's kind of like, it's like a disease. I just like, I can't help myself. I'm like, I must. And then as soon as I get the idea, Dave, where I'm like, wait a minute, imagine if I just did this and it was just a little bit better. And then I tell myself, I don't need to do that. I don't need to worry about that. And then of course, once I've already put that bug inside my brain, it's
the OCD
zero chance I'm not doing it. I'm doing it. And I try to go all the way like that. I just feel like the patches deserve that polish, and I try to like add extra stuff, like little cheat functions, like hold L and R and then you get infinite credits if you want, stuff like that.
And it's greatly appreciated. It goes so far to making the whole thing feel retail, basically. Like it's like a time machine. So coming back around the table to Bo, what you do is very different, I would say, than a lot of the translation work. You're hacking up the games, you're making them behave differently, you're bringing back lost functionality or hidden functionality. What has been the greatest challenge for you in that kind of work?
Well, I have done a little bit of the translation stuff. I helped with the Spanish retranslation of Resident Evil that came out a little bit ago. But so I've done a little bit of the terrible text hacking mines, but not my major focus. Now my white whale is like getting the textures to work in between the Sonic games. So like imagine you could play Sonic in Nights, and I've got the model going, I got Sonic in there, but he looks like this horrifying zombie because the textures are all wrong. And it's just that, like, open up a spreadsheet, like number them all, find space for them all. It's just mind-numbing work that I'm grinding away on. But what's really gratifying about like learning these tools and learning these games and figuring out how different developers did stuff, you'll learn one thing in one game and then be able to go back and apply that trick to something else. So like I've taken a couple of cracks at Dark Savior, like, okay, what's unused in there? There's like hundreds of scenes and there's the 5 different parallels and the story branches in a bunch of different ways. And I looked at it a couple of times, didn't get anywhere with it. But recently I found something that made it click. And so now I've got it like totally broken open.
Wow.
I just got the strategy guide in yesterday. So I'm trying to see like, okay, where's every picture in there? Like now I can see what's unused and what's not unused. And then we've got a couple of prototypes of it that I can go in, and there's some really cool stuff. I'm looking forward to publishing that one.
Oh, that's amazing. I had no idea with Dark Savior. So like a lot of these games, it's crazy to think, how much it remains to be uncovered, kind of breathes new life into these titles. And
well, and what's kind of cool too is like the cheat codes that I've found that have remained hidden for 20 to 30 years. You would think everybody would do cheat codes kind of the same way, right? Like, okay, here's a buffer of buttons you've put in and let's match the buffer. But no two people do it the same way. Like, even within the same game, you can tell two different developers worked on it and they're like, oh, obviously this is the way I would do it.
Right.
But then once you learn one scheme, you can think, okay, well, this other game had some code that looked kind of like that. I wonder if that is a cheat code.
When you do these, essentially do like a patched game that basically uses like a cheat code to unlock certain functionality or something, you typically have to release a separate image for folks to download and try. Is there any possibility of being able to like hijack the existing menu? I think you did that with one of the Burning Rangers thing where, but like with some of these games, is it possible to hijack like the existing menu so that you can basically make a definitive version of the game and everybody can just use that version with the enhancements that you've included?
Oh, yeah, there was like the high velocity has the 4-player mode that's hidden. And had I been able to like find some space to like rewrite the menu, maybe you could have put a new menu item in there. But like a lot of these games, they're using everything available to them.
Right.
And like there's no space in the RAM to do anything else.
I gotcha. Yeah.
That actually was a sort of a tip from Malenko. He said something about high velocity. I think it was the movie where there's the jack-o'-lantern character. Is this used? Turns out that it's not used.
Oh, from Atlas.
Yeah, from Atlas.
Nice.
And then I started poking around and found the 4-player mode randomly.
Yeah. What about Kingdom Grand Prix? You basically unlocked an entire translation in that game, right? And that was something Malenko tipped you off about?
I think we both credit each other like, oh, he did all the work. I just helped with it. So I say that about him, and I think he said that about me. But yeah, he found that the English translation from the arcade game is in there, hidden, and then I figured out how to make it the default.
He gets all the credit.
Yeah, he gets all the credit. I agree.
But I mean, okay, so Burning Rangers, for example, there's a versus mode that you unlocked, and then there's like a co-op mode. One of them had like a menu option, right?
Yeah, versus mode you can put back in the menu, but it's like not very fun to play. Like it's very unfinished.
So can you use that menu item to point to the co-op mode?
Yeah, probably. The trick with that one is that it's compressed, and so I have to do with all the shenanigans to like decompress it and change it and put it back, and then okay, now it's bigger than what it was, and reorder it. And...
The co-op mode is pretty cool, I have to say. I mean, like the versus mode is cool, but that you found it and everything. But you're right, it does feel a bit unfinished. But the co-op mode is actually pretty neat. So
it's really weird that they like pivoted from this, like, mostly working thing that's like more robust than Tales and Sonic Adventure to this like very broken virtual on kind of experience, and then cut it entirely.
And then cut it entirely.
There's this amazing thing about the US version of Burning Rangers. So they re-encoded the WAV files from for the bonus. You put the disc in your PC and there's some WAV files of the characters talking. And so when they re-encoded it, there's some junk after the WAV data that is just like random memory from the developer's machine. And so we have like internal Sega bug tracking stuff in these WAV files. And there's like up until mid-January, they're filing bug reports against 2-player mode. And then a bunch of them are closed out of like, all right, 2-player mode is cut. And the BR dev cycle was pretty crazy, I think.
I know you guys have dug pretty much all you can into Knights. And I mean, you just released this pedestrian hack, which is really fun. You walk around on the ground to do each mission. But I've always wondered, like, is there any possibility that there was more to the versus mode hidden? You know, because
absolutely, yeah.
Oh, really?
I think there was way more 2-player stuff than
what we actually got.
Yeah, like the split screen can work on any stage, or any of the boss stages rather. And in the final game, it only is active in the Reala fight. But it's not difficult to make the game control multiple characters with different controllers. So think of the final fight with Wiseman, where you've got both Elliot and Claris. It's not hard to map one of them to player 2.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, you did also release a hack where it was like synchronized swimming or synchronized flying, with, double character, Elliot and Claire is both flying at the same time. And that was such
I
a
got
trip.
3 on there at one point.
Oh, you did? Yeah.
Yeah. And Knights, Burning Rangers, the Sonic Team Saturn games, they all use kind of the same system. So you can control 4 Burning Rangers at once. I got Sonic and Tails controllable together on Sonic Jam. I've got Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles controllable together on 3D Blast.
It's kind of fun that you're able to like work in this large pool of like Sonic Team games that are all kind of similar. So one game it kind of informs another. They were like sharing code between games and stuff. So it kind of makes it interesting, the things that you find and the similarities between those games. And of course, Burning Rangers was like the spiritual predecessor to Sonic Adventure, right? There's a lot of DNA from, at least from what I've heard, there's a lot of DNA from Burning Rangers that made it into Sonic Adventure.
Yeah, I don't know, code-wise, like I've looked a little bit into Sonic Adventure, that, as Derek said, the tooling is getting better on Dreamcast, and I have to flip my brain the other way from the way he did, from little Indian to big. I have to go the other way. But yeah, I'm going to get into the Dreamcast stuff pretty soon.
Yeah, I mean, so Trekkie's comments that Burning Rangers was precursor for PSO, which I don't disagree. I mean, you definitely got
that's absolutely true. Yeah,
that is very obvious to see the influence and to some degree reused assets, or I don't know. There's a lot of similarities that I've noticed with Burning Rangers and Sonic Adventure, and I guess that could just be the fact that it's Sonic Team, same people, so they and of course, like a lot of people didn't play Burning Rangers, so then they end up kind of reusing certain
they just list the storyline from
exactly
from Burning Rangers and Sonic Adventure 2.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's crazy. They're just like, well, nobody played this, so we can get away with it. But that's neat. So I guess what types of new and creative patches or game modifications do you think might be on the horizon?
I'm looking at my list of unfinished stuff. I think I'm going to do something with Vadalva real soon now.
That's like almost like a Smash predecessor.
It's like
that.
I think of it as like,
it's like a 6-player battle royale with cars kind of thing.
Interesting.
Like car combat game. Yeah. That one I've been working on for a while. One I mentioned, Dark Savior, I'm working on. I've got something I'm trying to finish for Savaki, which is a kind of an obscure
mixed martial arts
fighting game. Yeah. That I'm excited about. But like I said, I've got stuff through January if I can keep up the 1-a-week pace.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Trekkies? Is there anything down the road that you're thinking about or interested in working on?
For me personally, like I want to finish up the translation patches that I have on my plate currently. But after that, like I've been kind of wanting to get more into just like the homebrew side of it.
Right.
So just writing things. Like there's a couple things I've been snooping around at that I'd want to take a peek at. So one is I'd like to see if I could do like a DDR clone on the Saturn. So see if I could get that working. Make it compatible with like Stepmania files, that kind of thing. The other one I'd love to take a crack at, but every time I've looked at it, I'm like, this is going to be a pain in the butt. And that's now that they have like the Sonic Mania and the Sonic CD and all that decompilation projects going over on Sonic Retro and that, I'd like to see it take a crack at it. But every time I've looked at it, the big pain in the butt there is the assets are just not Saturn friendly. So it's like the amount of work that would need to go in there to converting all those assets is just something I don't want to deal with.
Right.
But the other thing like I'd like to try and get sorted out at some point is I've been trying to use Ghidra to decompile the Cinepack libraries from Sega to see if then we could figure out how to get like ADX audio going and that on it. And then that would be like the final like cherry on top of getting like Cinepack completely like cracked.
Right. Which you've pretty much, you've exhausted with that tool and everything like that. You pretty much pushed Cinepack as far as it can go visually on the Saturn, which I should say is really good. I mean, it's quite comparable to like the MPEG stuff. Maybe the MPEG is a little bit better, but it's a piece of hardware that you have to buy, right?
I'd say it's comparable to PS1's MJPEG variant that they did.
Right.
MPEG 1 is still going to edge it out because it's going to edge out even like PS1.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just, I would say Cinepack is comparable enough for game cutscenes of that generation.
Right.
If you know what you're doing and you set the compression settings correctly, you can get something that's 1-to-1 comparable with the PS1. I'd say like 90% of the time.
It's a shame that a lot of people didn't have that kind of insight back then, because it's pretty trivial once you know the settings, and it's not that big of a challenge.
It's really not, because like I said, the only thing I've ever really done is I read the manuals. I read the manuals from Sega, and then I also took a peek at the ones from 3DO. And between those, because they both 3DO and Saturn used Cinepack, and they both used QuickTime for their encoding.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, when you look at that, it's like, this really wasn't hard, and like they had it all right there, even back in like 94. So it's like, I don't get how they got quality as bad as they got it for some of these games.
Just leaving it on the default, right? Like
that's the only explanation I can come up with, really.
Yeah, low effort, basically. And the fact that they looked at it in playback and didn't say, like, we could do better than this,
Well, it was like when they, I don't know if it was Sega of America or Sega of Japan, they pushed to have like True Motion and that, which is like, yeah, it's nice having another codecs, and True Motion is nice. But it's at the same time, I'm like, I don't really know if True Motion is really, when you actually like figure out how to make Cinepack work, I'm not sure if True Motion is really like, I don't know if it was worth the investment they put into
right.
it, if that makes sense.
Because
like it's not a bad codec or anything like that. It's just
right. It's better than default Cinepack, right? And so like,
it's better than badly encoded Cinepack.
Right.
But I mean, even then, it's like the True Motion encoder is like a behemoth to deal with. Like
right.
You open that thing up and you have like 50 different like sliders to play with, and it's like you can just sit there for days just playing with sliders to try and massage the best quality out of it you can. But it's like you really need to have like a very, very like deep understanding of video compression, which even I don't have, to really work that thing. So that's where I'm like, it's a nice codec, but was it really worth all that time and investment at the time? I think when you guys interviewed
Eric Alvarez, Dr.
When you
Eric
guys interviewed
Alvarez.
him, I think he mentioned like he had a lot of people just like reaching out to him, and he would help them with their encoding.
Right. We were never able to source like the most recent version of True Motion for the Saturn. There was like a later version, I think, that he might have used for like Enemy Zero.
Right.
And they never could find that, like the source for that.
It just hasn't popped up yet. It's
right.
We only have the 15-bit color version. We don't have the full 24-bit color version.
Right.
Which that 15-bit color version, it can look really rough at
right.
times because of all the dithering in that it has to do.
Yeah, so if we could ever find the 24-bit color version, it'd be fun to play around with.
Right. I'd love to play with it and see how it can actually stack up. It just hasn't popped up.
Hasn't unearthed yet. Yeah. Well, maybe one day, he'll find it on an old drive or something like that. We'll see. But yeah, so what about you, Malenko? Are there any like dream projects on the horizon? White whales?
I mean, obviously Princess Crown.
Princess
Crown. I'm just going to finish.
Somebody had to make that joke.
Yeah, might as well be me. I'm going to finish the two that I already started with Terra and Bomber Fight. I'll probably go back and do some quality of life fixes for NBA Jam, like getting the clock to run a little faster, fix the colors on the stats screen, add you and Pat to the game.
Deluxe edition.
I already have your heads from Albert AM25.
Oh, nice.
He sent them all over to me, so I've just got to like turn them to the right angles and texture them right, and then put them in the game.
Well, that'll be fun. I'm sure some folks will hate you for it. Right? They'll be like, that's not the real game. You're always going to get haters who are like, you spent like an entire year or more of your life on these translations. Then somebody's like, I just want to play the original. And you're just like, okay, well, why say anything? just go play the original.
Yeah, I am proud to say that I have successfully hidden Craig Stadler in Bomberman Fight.
How about Terra Fantastic?
We're not far enough in yet, but he'll make a cameo.
He'll make
somewhere.
a cameo appearance.
I'll find a way to put him in there.
Good old Walrus. Oh man, yeah. Princess Crown, though, you mentioned that. What a cursed project, It's like that's the one that everybody brings up. When's Princess Crown going to come out? And we're all just like, I don't know. Ask somebody else. We're not working on it.
I don't understand the obsession with that game, and the
Vanillaware is
fan base around it is just
it's
so toxic at this point. It's like I don't get it. I don't blame people for not wanting to like touch that with a 10-foot pole at this point.
Yeah, I mean it's been rough. I don't know how many hands have touched it.
I don't really have an interest in that game at all, but I think the only other thing I'll poke around with is probably working with Trekkies on finally cracking Street Fighter 03.
Oh
It's doing
yeah.
that thing he was talking about previously, where each character has their own like array of Japanese that is unique to them. So there's like 30 or whatever different ones to get through. And I started
Yeah, that
working
was
on
just
Root. It kind of wore me out, so I stopped.
yeah, that was just weird. Like how they did stuff in that. It was just kind of odd.
Hmm.
But it's the best version of the game,
It
so they
is the
must have done
best
something
version
right.
of the game, yeah. And it's a phenomenal game for what it's worth. Yeah, that would be amazing. Well, I get to close us out. I will flip it over to Bo, and I'm going to ask, what is your favorite thing about the Sega Saturn?
That I can play Burning Rangers on it.
That it can play Burning
Um,
Rangers. I don't know why I'm surprised.
No, this started as an innocent thing of like, I wonder how many ways you can rescue Yuji Naka in Burning Rangers. Turns out the answer is 16 million. And then it just snowballed. So, I'm happy that I answered that question. Everything else is bonus.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Trekkies? What is your favorite thing about the Sega Saturn?
I mean, I just find that it's an interesting, unique system to poke around with. So it's like there's just so many little like interesting things you can see with any part of the system. So like with Cinepack, even just playing with like the video decoding, there's so many different little things you can tweak and play with the different like video chips. So like I can have VDP1 display it as like a quad, and I can twist it and make a bow tie, and it looks really funky and janky, but you can do it. You can put it on VDP2, and you could put it on a rotating plane if you want. There's just a lot of like interesting little things to like play with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the console that keeps on giving. This community is amazing. Like, I think that's the stuff that you guys are doing is half the reason why it's such an exciting system still, and then people are finding out about all these projects that are coming out. If it wasn't for the community, it wasn't for the fans, I don't think it would be half as amazing as it has been over the past renaissance of Saturn projects since 2018 or whatever. What about you, Malenko? What is your favorite thing about the Sega Saturn?
It's a bit of an odd answer, but I love like the chunky quad 3D models. It's very unique. Like when you see a Saturn model, it's from a Saturn game and not a PlayStation game or something like that.
Right.
Like, I know I'm probably not in the norm, but I really liked the look of the original Virtua Fighter over Virtua Fighter 2. I don't like the texture map stuff. I like the garage shading and stuff.
Mm-hmm. So as much as you love the 2D fighters and stuff like that, you actually do dig the Saturn 3D. Whereas a lot of folks say, oh, it's ugly, or, PlayStation looks better, but you like it.
I love it. And Toshinden looked like crap on the PlayStation. I mean, it looks like crap on the Saturn too. But...
Yeah, Toshinden is just crap.
Yeah. But yeah, I love the chunky fighters.
Saturn is just like this incredibly powerful sprite pushing machine. And the fact that it draws 3D graphics using sprites is not a knock, actually, or a demerit on the system. In my mind, that just makes it cooler,
So this is something like I was actually discussing with the 3DO people a while back, and it's like it's very misleading to say that Saturn's 3D is just sprites, because when you look at the command for how it draws them, it still takes like 4 vertices.
Sure.
So I mean, like 3DO, they're more in that realm where you can maybe make the argument it's just a sprite being distorted, because I don't think their command doesn't take 4 vertices. It takes like 1 point, and then they do some jank to make it work.
Right.
Whereas like ours is like you still do all your 3D math on the CPU and you feed it the vertices, and VDP1 draws it. It's just drawing a quad that has no texture coordinates.
Without a Z buffer, it's crazy like how much math they have to do to kind of like perspective correct everything.
Right, and it's like, but that's on the PS1 as well. So it's like there's a lot of people who say like Saturn's not a 3D console because it's just drawing sprites, but that's a real like misconception that it really just needs to die.
Yeah, it does. I mean, the thing is 3D is 3D. Like you're making a 3D image. It doesn't matter how you get there.
Right, and it's like
I really like those pseudo 3D games like Dark Savior, where it's we've kind
it's one of those things where it's
perspective
like
here. Yeah.
A lot like there's a lot more similarities between how Saturn and PS1 like will draw like the final scene, I guess, than people will actually realize, because it's like you're still doing all that 3D math on the CPUs and the DSP on Saturn, or the CPUs and the GT on the PS1, and you're sending those commands to the GPU to draw the polygons. On Saturn, it's just you're drawing a quad with no texture coordinates. On PS1, you're drawing triangles with texture coordinates.
Right.
And even then, PS1, I think, does have a quad command. Behind the scenes, it draws 2 triangles, but from a programmer standpoint, you can still just say draw a quad. So it's like it's very misleading to say it's like, oh, it's a 2D machine drawing sprites trying to do 3D. No, they're 3D commands. They are like commands there to draw 3D textured polygons.
Mm-hmm.
It's really just you have texture coordinates versus no texture coordinates.
Right.
That's really the big difference between them, I'd say.
So rather than mapping a large texture over a sphere, it's like dicing every facet up into like a separate quote unquote sprite.
Yeah. So like, well, before you draw that, like in your asset setup, you have to basically break those textures up on Saturn. Whereas on PS1, you can define texture coordinates to cut like this piece of the texture out.
Right.
So that's really like I'd say is like the main difference that you have to overcome with on Saturn when you're doing that kind of stuff.
I gotcha.
I think it's really cool also how you can see just from 95 to 98, like how much more they were able to squeeze out of the Saturn.
Mm-hmm.
Like, even those ones like post the US market ending, like they're still innovating on those.
Well, like the one that like I find at least interesting is when you hear all these people and even like certain developers from back then saying like, oh, how difficult Saturn was to develop. It took like years to get anything on the screen and all this kind of stuff. Then you look at Sega Rally, which like this was a team that was like green, had like the programmers who were doing Sega Rally on the Saturn, from like what Nick's documentary said, this was their first game that they were ever writing ever. Mm-hmm. Their first 3D they're ever writing ever. They're not using any source code from the arcade. So they're building this from scratch, and they went from nothing to game on store shelf in what, like 9 months?
Yeah, that's
so it's
pretty
like,
amazing.
And that's like before they didn't have SGL, they didn't have the nicer, newer dev kits. So it's like, if it was truly that horrifying to develop for, how did that happen? Is my thing. So I'm like, there's almost like a disconnect where it's like you have these people saying like it was impossible to program for, but then you have, well, here's a completely green team that just spit out like probably the best looking racing game on the system in under a year.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where like at times I'm kind of just sitting there like kind of like with a raised eyebrow, like, is it really that hard, or is there something else going on?
Well, maybe it was like you said with Cinepack, like you actually have to read the manual.
Right.
Some folks like to read a little bit more than others.
Yep.
I mean, one thing is true. We know that Saturn had a lot of documentation, and it wasn't the, programming for dummies days where
right.
You're just going to be given a tool that does everything for you. It's like, here's the documentation. Here's how the chips work. It's up to you to get the most out of them,
Right. And it's one of those things where it's like the people early on, like the ones doing the Virtua Racing ports, SimCity 2000, I understand they did have a hard time because they were getting incomplete documentation from Sega of America.
Translated. Yeah.
It wasn't even fully translated. They didn't even have a dev kit. They had to go share one at midnight at Sega of America and this kind of stuff. So that I get. But there's almost like this kind of thing where it's like you have these people saying like it was always hard to develop for, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, there's a point where by like 95, I'd say, is like where they had the C libraries, they had the C compilers, SGLs available. You had the cart dev kit. It's like there's a point where it's like, where is it like, was it actually difficult? And where was it where it was becoming more of just like an excuse to not put resources into it, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's easy to become kind of lazy and go for good enough, whereas some folks, good enough is not good enough. And they're willing to kind of go all the way. I mean, Sonic Team was one of those internal teams that just had to do everything to the max. I mean, the way that they're making Burning Rangers work on a technical level is ridiculous. But I mean, they're like, we're determined to get the fire working, and we want it to be translucent. We're determined to get things working and looking like this. So we're gonna kind of bend over backwards to make the hardware do what we want. And then you get some teams who are just like, it's good enough.
Because like the thing that's interesting, if I remember correctly, the transparency technique they do in Burning Rangers, I think it's actually mentioned in one of the technical bulletins from Sega of America back in like 96, 97. So it's like, it was known that you could do that.
Right.
I think it's just I think them and I think Grandy are the only two I've seen actually do it.
Right.
And also obviously like XL2 with his stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think of a lot of the difficulty stuff is just like it's so different from what you would do on PlayStation, and if you're developing PlayStation first, then it's going to be very challenging to port it over.
It's
but
I think
if you're starting for Saturn, like didn't the Grandia devs have like a ton of trouble doing the PS version?
Right, because they were going from a system where they had
VDP2.
They had VDP2 and more VRAM to a system where they didn't have that.
Yeah.
Sony really spoiled devs, I think, with their SDKs and stuff.
And like the thing I think people overlook is how much of that came from them buying Psygnosis and SN Systems. Because before then, like Sony's dev kit was terrible. Like,
Right.
there's a picture of it online where it's like the original PS1 dev kit before they bought Psygnosis. It's almost as big as the Saturn Sophia one.
It is. Yep. It's
like,
huge.
And it's like it's just as clunky and horrible. So it's like, if that had not happened, it would have been very different, I think. And it's literally just like,
they got lucky.
It's basically they bought their way into good dev tools. And it's like, that's just an option that people like want to crap on Sega's dev tools. Like, they're really not as bad as people say they are. It's just Sony was able to buy really good dev tools by buying Psygnosis. And that's just an option that neither Sega or Nintendo had.
Sony bought their way into a lot of stuff. I mean, they bought their way into third parties, having them in their pocket.
Yep.
They bought their way into console exclusivity with like Tomb Raider 2.
Right.
You know, like they had money to throw their weight around, you know, from the consumer electronics industry.
Yep.
And the fact that they could manufacture everything in-house, you know, make a lot of their chips and do a lot of that stuff, you know.
Yep.
Having money, you can brute force your way, you know.
Yep.
It just Microsoft did kind of the same thing, you know, to push their way into the market.
Yeah, so it's like when people talk about like revisionist history, it's like, I don't think there's anything you could do to make either Nintendo or Sega win the 5th generation.
Right.
That's just not going to happen.
Because they're just a little rinky-dink games company, you know, doing things the traditional way, you know.
There's no way to like shuffle that deck to make that happen.
Yeah.
The best you could do is get like the real race that generation for the other companies was second place.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
The other problem with Sega though is they just hate money. It's like,
yes, it's like repellent.
They're just pathologically like incapable of success. Yeah, it's like,
I mean, but you know, so I applaud Sony for changing the industry on such a massive scale, and the things, the decisions they made, and the, you know, the innovations. And at the same time, it frustrates me to no end, because I'm like, if it wasn't for them, it would have been more apples to apples. Like developers would have been like, okay, well, you know, we have to work, we have to do hard work, you know, and this is what it is. But, you know, of course, like with Sony, you'd have dev teams balloon to, you know, much larger sizes, huge payrolls, huge, like grandiose projects, and a lot of like dummy tools that would basically help you get there.
Right. And it's like, I think like when people talk about like difficulty in development, I think the real takeaway is not Saturn and Sega's tools were bad. I don't think that's really the takeaway. The takeaway is more Sony truly revolutionized and redefined what good dev tools were. Yep. That's really more the better takeaway of it.
And then nobody was willing to be patient, you know, or take the time with the old way of doing things. It changed so quickly. And really, you know, it's often said the strength of the PlayStation was the third parties, right? Yeah. Well, all the third parties just wanted to have the easiest dev cycle and then have their game go out to the biggest install base, you know? So it was like, that basically.
Where it's like, I've seen people like accuse the homebrew community, like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about how hard it is to develop for Saturn because you weren't there using the tools and the libraries that devs were using back in the 90s. Just about like all of XL2's stuff is SGL.
Right.
He's heavily modified some of SGL, but it's still SGL. And
you've been using the old Mac interface. You've been having to use like an old...
I've been using an old Mac environment to encode Cinepack, and I'm using SBL.
Right.
I think CubeCat for the longest time was SGL, and I think it still is.
Yeah.
Ponit, I think some of his stuff is SGL with some heavy modifications as well. Emerald Nova, SGL.
He has Seven Shades has moved away from SGL though. Finally, like he's written his own rendering pipeline. But yeah, he used SGL almost exclusively at the beginning.
Right, and it's like Emerald Nova uses SGL for a lot of his stuff. Anyone who's using Joe Engine, you're using SGL. Joe Engine is just a wrapper around SGL.
Around SGL, yeah, that's crazy.
So it's like, it's one of those things where it's like, if they were truly that bad and horrible to work with, I don't think we would see the homebrew team like pumping these things out in their free time. So that's where, to me, I'm like, I kind of like raise an eyebrow when I hear people saying like, oh, the Saturn's libraries were bad. I'm like, I looked at them, I've read the documentation on them, I tinker with them. If they're bad, I'm not seeing it in the code that I'm tinkering with.
Yeah, I think it all is just like I said, it's what you're used to. So like SH2 is supposed to be like this difficult assembly, and probably is if what you're used to is the Sega Genesis and hacking on the Sonic games. Like it was surprising to me that there was stuff to find in those, given how thoroughly investigated the 16-bit games are. But it's, if you learn that, it doesn't really translate easily to a different language, and that's a big roadblock for people.
Yeah, and it's like like SH2 assembly, like it really isn't that bad. It's pretty straightforward. The main thing that like trips people up is a lot of the things they're expecting from coming from like older CPUs, like again, like the 68,000, is that they're expecting like arbitrary bit shifting and rotation and all that kind of stuff, where you can just like say like shift 4, shift 2, shift 3, shift 5, or whatever that you could do on like the 68K and that. Whereas on the SH2, you can only do like there's like shift 1, I think like shift 1, shift 2, shift 4, and shift 8, if I remember correctly, are the ones that
Right.
you have.
And even like within family, I find it very difficult to get into the Dreamcast stuff, and they're very similar. It's the same processor family, but like the Indians stuff is different. There's more commands, and you know, where you came from just decides what you find difficult.
Yeah, and it's like
Interesting.
with the shifting thing, like you can still make them work. You have to chain a couple of them together. But the thing that most people would be using that for, like on the 68,000 and that and the older processors, they were doing it to basically do like they could be used to kind of like optimize multiplication division, because you could kind of get an approximation by using shifting to kind of get close. Whereas on the SH2, we don't need to do that. We have a very fast multiplication unit that can pump out like a 30. You can multiply, I think, like two 32-bit numbers in like 3 clock cycles.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really interesting too. Like you can see some developers really going out of their way to avoid multiplying, and
it's like,
I think it's just probably where they came from. It's like, oh yeah, that's too expensive, we can't do it.
But it's like on the SH2, it's like it's really not. If you're multiplying, I think it's like 2 16-bits, it can be done in one cycle, if I remember correctly. It has a division unit that can divide, and I think the max it takes is anywhere from like, I think it's like 30 to 60 cycles, something like that, depending on what you're dividing. But what's neat about it is you can basically throw the stuff at it, and it can sit there doing it while you're chugging through other stuff on the CPU. So if you optimize your code properly and say like, hey, I'm going to need this divide done in like 60 cycles, give it that, then go do a couple other things, come back, it's ready for you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, both CPUs are able to do that. So it's one of those things where I think when people are saying like, oh, SH2 is weird, and some of the things they're complaining about, it's like, well, what you're complaining about is not something you would actually really need to do on that, because you have other tools available that can help you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but like I find going back to be harder because I'm used to SH2, and like I don't know, they're doing all these tricks because they got no memory, and like you don't have to do that on Saturn as much. So yeah, where you come from determines what you find easy.
Mm-hmm. It was somewhat famously said by Yu Suzuki that if you were, your dev team was firing on all cylinders and you were trying to squeeze every last drop out of the Saturn, you could probably get like 1.5 times the power of an SH2. You probably couldn't like get the full 2 SH2s. And what was that, down to like bus contention?
Right, because they both share the same 32-bit bus.
Mm-hmm.
So when they're both trying to read from memory, they're going to collide with each other, and the master is usually going to win over the slave.
Mm-hmm.
So the trick is basically to try and get as much out of it is try and give the slave CPU something it can just go off and do on its own, running in its 4 kilobyte of cache, whereas the master is doing all the other stuff with memory, and then they only need to come to and touch memory when they need it.
Right.
So,
and that requires timing, like orchestrating the timing, and that's something that some developers just didn't want to bother with.
Well, the thing that's kind of neat is, if I remember correctly, SGL is like the bulk of its 3D, like all the 3D math pipeline and that fits in the slave CPU's cache. Mm-hmm. So games that are using SGL, they are having the second CPU sit there and crunch through all the 3D math and that in its cache on its own in parallel.
Mm.
Yeah, but you got to think also, mid-90s, a lot of programmers are not used to doing parallel execution of stuff at all, just even on PC.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's, when you bring up PC, I think that's where a lot of like the struggle comes from. And I think it's kind of like a Western, like American and UK devs versus the Japanese devs kind of thing. Whereas like in the US and UK, a lot of devs were coming from like the PC mindset, where it's like you have one CPU, a GPU, maybe a sound processor, and an operating system over it. Whereas in Japan, it's like you had a lot of people coming from like arcade, where it's like you look at Sega's arcade hardware, some of Namco's, and some of them, it's like they do have a buttload of CPUs in there that they're distributing everything to.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Model 1 board, it's like it's all CPU brute force. It has like, I think like 5 or 6 DSPs, and they're all just crunching through 3D math.
Right.
So it's like, when you look at that, it's like, I think that's why you see like with Saturn, you see a lot more polish coming from the Japanese side than you do from the US and UK side.
Sure.
Save for a few like exceptions like Traveler's Tales and Lobotomy.
Yeah, like when you look at the Saturn's architecture to a Western eye, it just looks convoluted and overly complicated. But when you think of it in terms of the company and the heritage that it's coming from, which is like arcade boards, it actually doesn't look that crazy at all. Like, it's like, yeah, okay, this is a company that makes arcade games, and this is nothing really special compared to like a lot of those bespoke arcade boards that have tons of chips and are doing a ton of stuff, like you said.
Well, because like I think it's the X or Y board from Sega that ran Galaxy Force. I think that has like 3 or 4 68,000s in it running in parallel, trying to run in parallel at least.
Right.
Where it's like, that's a CPU that, to my knowledge, was not designed for that purpose. Whereas the SH2 actually did have some stuff designed to run in that configuration.
Yeah. They called it Cascade, right? Like Cascade support.
Yeah, something like that, or just like, I think it was master slave support or something like that is what they called it.
It wasn't like something that Sega really planned on, and I think Hitachi just kind of like put that in there as a supported feature, and it ended up like the Saturn ended up banking on that.
Yeah, it was basically a thing of where originally I think Sega wanted them to increase the clock speed, and they said, well, we can't really do that in this short amount of time and be able to guarantee like quality parts to you. So instead they said, we do have this thing where you can put them in a master slave configuration instead and use 2 CPUs, and that's what they went with.
So do you think that homebrew devs nowadays, like with all of the hindsight and information that we have, do you think we can ever get close to, using both to their full potential? Or do you think it's always going to be that kind of like 1.5? Like,
it's hard to quantify, really.
Yeah.
I'd say it's one of those things where it really depends what you're trying to do.
Right.
Because like XL2 said, like with his stuff, he's like, I didn't even try and bother with trying to like get them to not step on each other's toes. I just try to come up with the fastest algorithms possible and say, YOLO, let it go. and that's basically like, yeah. And it's like, so, I mean, when he can get that working and it's working pretty well, honestly, I don't know how much you really do need to focus on optimizing. That's one of those things where people are going on about like how weak the Saturn is. And it's like, yeah, the PS1 is going to be faster and more powerful. And I think Ponut said, like, if both are running it, like pushing it to the limits, like Saturn's going to be like 75 to 80% of what PS1 is capable of, I think was how Ponut quantified it years ago. And it's one of those things where when you really look at some of those games, though, I don't think any PS1 games really were pushing it to that limit when you really look at some of them. Because it's like, we see like what Frogbull's done. He's got basically like Metal Gear Solid demo running that pretty much looks pretty darn close and 1-to-1 with the PS1. It's like that's one of the most like technically demanding games for that system back when it came out. It's like other than like dumping like piles of additive blending and transparencies on the screen, like it's one of those ones where I don't really know if Saturn's really that underpowered for its time. That like people like try to say it's so underpowered, and it's like
equal and opposite. People like to say that it's got a bunch of untapped potential. I mean, what do you make of that?
They need to quantify what that potential is. Like that's the thing. It's like the way I would say it is like, yes, PS1 is more powerful, but Saturn's good enough to be competitive.
Right.
It's one of those things where it's like there's certain things it can do that it can edge out the PS1 in still, and it's one of those ones where it's good enough to be competitive for its time. Because like look at the PC Engine, Genesis, and SNES. They're not like 1-to-1 in spec wise, and there's certain things that they all each can do better than the other. So it's like they were all able to be competitive. Look at the 6th generation, like the gap between Dreamcast, PS2, GameCube, and Xbox. There's wide gaps between all 3 of those systems, and like some are able to do things to get around it and that, but they're all able to be competitive. And
at the end of the day, you just got to make fun games that use the hardware. As long as the game is well made, folks are going to enjoy it.
And it's like, look at the 7th gen. It's like you have the Xbox and PS3 versus the Wii, and the Wii kicked their butts.
True.
So it's like,
how accessible are your games, basically?
Right. And it's one of those things where you can still make nice looking games on the Saturn that can be competitive in that. Would be my thing on it.
I really wish that I had like a course on retro game CPU architecture or something in school, because like I have a degree in computer engineering, but I feel like just hacking on these Saturn games is such a better education than anything I ever did in school. And throughout my career, I've been always like a back end kind of person and have avoided learning anything about graphics. But I can't avoid that now, so I'm catching up a little bit. But really good education. Like I said, I'm like kind of still learning Ghidra to be able to use it professionally.
Mhm.
And I don't know how you could learn it better than like something you're really interested in and trying to make it do stuff. It's like it's very hands-on, it's very practical, it's super educational.
Do you think there's any possibility in the near or far future that you might dip your toe into like homebrew?
Like I said, I'm very ignorant on graphics at all. Like if I have to make something do anything other than print out the terminal in my work, it's like,
Mhm.
oh boy, this is a big project. But I don't know. I think there's a lot of like untapped stuff that people haven't seen in
Right.
games. Like, you know, sometimes it's hidden, sometimes it's unused, sometimes it got cut. So I think
That's
I'm
kind of
gonna
your
try
niche.
to,
That's been
yeah,
your
try to exhaust that. And I am maybe coming to the limits of like the US catalog of Saturn games of like, okay, I've looked at almost everything. I'll run it out at some point and then need to keep myself
but
occupied.
there's so many Japanese games though that you can look at. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, Dave, there's this oldie but a goodie. It's like why you don't let engineers design user interfaces.
Oh,
Like
right.
I think
Yeah.
I think that's where you're coming
Definitely
from,
me.
Bo, with like doing graphics and that.
Yeah. Though, I mean, XL2, you know, he said that his whole thing was like he knew C programming basically, you know?
Yeah.
And he like, he knew nothing. And then it was like, before you know it, he was just drawing a cube to the screen and then, you know, more
Right.
and more and more and adding onto that. And Seven Shades was kind of the same deal, you know? And now he's like writing his own rendering pipeline.
Right. And it's like a thing like I came from a Java background and I was able to start tinkering and getting things up and running.
Yeah.
So it's like it's really not that bad.
That's why you hate Python so much.
Python is slow.
Yeah. Yeah. I understand Java guys don't, and Python people don't get along very well.
Maybe
mean,
that'll be my project. It's a Python interpreter for Saturn.
Yeah.
Like we both in some of my projects we use both Java and Python for things, but it's like I like having data types. So I think is Python the one that doesn't have data types, where it's all var, if I remember correctly?
It's complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I'm like, no, give me my data types, please. Like there's a person I worked with when I was on an embedded software team who he loved to just like make everything auto. And I'm like, no, stop doing this. I want to know what type I'm getting.
That's funny. Yeah. I mean, you know, that makes sense though. Programmers, engineers can be very specific about the environment that they like to work in.
I'm kind of in the camp of like most of your major programming language, they all have their place where they excel.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like you can't use them all for the same thing. Like I would not try and write a Saturn game in Java. That would just be insane.
Yeah.
Because one, you would need to port the JVM to the Saturn, and that's just going to be slow as hell trying to run like that. But whereas Java excels very well is like in doing like your web interfaces, your web server code, any of that kind of stuff. And it also really excels in making tools because it very much embraces that compile once, run anywhere mentality. So like, for example, the Film Muxer, I just compile one jar and it can run on Mac, Linux, and Windows just fine.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to wrap it here. If folks probably have noticed that Malenko and Derek had to drop off, but well, I appreciate all of you guys coming on and chatting with me about this technical stuff. I realize this isn't going to be for everybody, but yeah, for folks who like to kind of get some insight into the technical side of things, definitely been a long time coming. I've been wanting to do this podcast with you guys, and there's a lot of talent and a lot of knowledge here. And I'm hoping that folks listening to this, if you're interested in, you know, either developing homebrew for the Saturn or getting into a translation, that you reach out to the folks on our SHIRO Discord. They can get you pointed in the right direction. Malenko, as he mentioned, has done tutorials on how to get started with the tools like Crystal Tile and hex editors and get into patching and translating Saturn games. But there's several folks here who are super friendly and willing to help you out. If you're willing to do the hard work and most of the heavy lifting, they'll point you in the right direction at least. You know, it might be daunting and a little bit intimidating at first, and it is work, but it's rewarding because a lot of people get to play your projects and enjoy it. Sega Extreme is also an amazing resource, kind of a brother or sister site to SHIRO. We love those guys. And if you really want a deeper understanding and you have super technical questions, Sega Extreme also has a Discord that's pretty active and There's a bunch of folks there that can answer your questions as well. Where can we find you guys if folks want to reach out to you? Maybe Bo, if they want to contact you about a certain game that they're interested in having you look at, or project that they want you to patch, like where can they find you?
Yeah, I'm on 32bits.substack.com, and on Twitter, I'm memory_fallen, one of those two.
Mm-hmm.
You'll find it. Search for Burning Rangers. I'm on there.
How about you, Trekkies?
Just Sega Extreme, or in the Sega Extreme Discord, probably.
Mm-hmm. Look for the show from Burning Rangers.
Yeah, I've had this avatar since like 2007 or 8 on the old Sega forums.
Yeah, that's funny. And it's like now I see that face and I'm just like, that's Trekkies. Just like with Night of Dragon, he's Symbios from Shining Force 3. Malenko, I believe you can find him on Sega Extreme as well. Also the SHIRO Discord. He's in the SHIRO Discord almost daily. And Derek Pascarella, ATEAM, can be found on dreamcastforever.com. Definitely check out his website and check out his projects. He's done both Saturn and Dreamcast, so that's awesome. Thank you, both of you, for all of the great stuff that you've given to this community, the hacks and the patches, translations, the tools, Trekkies, making it easier for folks to do more projects. Really, it's, you guys don't get paid for this, but it's something that you're passionate about, and we're just lucky because we get to reap the benefit of your guys' work. So really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks for having us.
And until next time, this has been SaturnDave, TrekkiesUnite 118, Bo Bayles, Derek Pascarella, ATEAM, and Malenko, reminding you that you must play your Sega Saturn. And we'll catch you next time.
Saturn, shoot!